Morality, the tribal compass. The conviction that certain actions are intrinsically right and others fundamentally wrong feels deeply ingrained, almost self-evident. Yet, a dispassionate examination of human history and diversity reveals a starkly different picture. Morality is not a universal truth discovered, but a biological and cultural adaptation forged in the crucible of group survival. Our profound sense of right and wrong, and the visceral certainty accompanying it, likely originated not from divine revelation or philosophical deduction, but as an essential mechanism for binding small, interdependent ancestral groups together. This evolutionary perspective presents a challenging truth. What we experience as objective moral truth is, at its core, a tribal compass, calibrated for in-group cohesion rather than universal application. The evolutionary logic underpinning this view is grounded in the harsh realities of human prehistory. For our ancestors living in small bands, cooperation was not merely beneficial. It was a prerequisite for survival against environmental threats, resource scarcity, and conflict with other groups. Natural selection would have strongly favored psychological traits that enhanced within-group coordination, trust, and mutual support. Behaviors promoting these ends, sharing food, defending kin and allies, reciprocating favors, punishing those who violated group norms, cheaters, free riders, or those causing internal conflict, became associated with positive emotional responses perceived as good or right. Conversely, behaviors threatening group stability, theft, betrayal, violence against members, failure to reciprocate, triggered negative emotions perceived as bad or wrong. These emotional responses, the raw material of moral intuition, served a vital function. They incentivized cooperation and deterred behaviors detrimental to the collective unit upon which individual survival often depended. The profound implication of this evolutionary origin is the inherent relativity and tribalism of our foundational moral intuitions. The compass points towards the well-being and cohesion of our group. Actions vehemently condemned when perpetrated outside the group might be lauded, or at least tolerated within it. Historical and anthropological records provide ample evidence. Raiding a neighboring group, seizing their resources, and even killing their members could be framed as valor and necessary defense within one's tribe, while the same actions committed within the group would constitute the gravest crimes. Concepts of fairness, justice, and loyalty find their primary application within the in-group boundary. What constitutes theft or fair distribution can vary dramatically depending on who is included in us. Similarly, obligations of loyalty and reciprocity are typically strongest towards kin and close allies, diminishing sharply across group lines. This deep-seated tribalism is not a minor flaw, but a fundamental feature arising directly from the selective pressures that shaped our moral psychology. This evolutionary grounding helps explain the persistent and often violent moral conflicts observed across cultures and throughout history. When individuals or groups possess deeply felt, yet fundamentally group-anchored, moral intuitions, clashes become almost inevitable. The intense conviction accompanying these intuitions, the feeling that one's position is objectively and universally true, is itself a product of evolution. This powerful sense of moral certainty was adaptive. It strengthened commitment to group norms and facilitated collective action. However, it also creates a significant cognitive barrier to recognizing the contingent, group-serving nature of one's moral foundations. The bitter truth is that the very feeling of objective moral truth is an evolutionary illusion, a potent psychological mechanism effective for binding the in-group together, often in opposition to outgroups. It is not evidence of access to universal moral principles, but rather of the success of an evolved strategy for survival within a specific social context. This tribal instinct, forged for survival in a world of small competing groups, extends far beyond abstract notions of morality. It permeates the very fabric of human sociality, shaping even our most fundamental bonds and intimate relationships in ways that might surprise us when examined through the lens of evolutionary necessity. The drive to protect and prioritize kin, the complexities of mate selection and partnership, and the formation of alliances and friendships all bear the imprint of strategies honed for navigating the challenges of group living in our ancestral past. The monogamy mirage. The cultural ideal of lifelong, exclusive romantic partnership holds significant sway, often presented as the natural and fundamental structure of human intimacy. However, an examination grounded in evolutionary anthropology and psychology reveals a more complex picture of human mating strategies, challenging the notion that strict sexual monogamy represents our sole, innate biological imperative. While humans possess a strong capacity for forming enduring pair bonds, crucial for the extended care required by our slow-developing offspring, the empirical evidence consistently points towards a more flexible underlying reality. Cross-cultural anthropological studies provide compelling counter-evidence to the universality of lifelong monogamy. While socially imposed monogamy exists in many contemporary societies, historical records and ethnographic data from diverse cultures reveal a wide spectrum of marital and sexual arrangements. Polygyny, one male, multiple females, though often restricted by resource availability and social status, has been permitted or practiced in a substantial majority of documented human societies. Furthermore, even within societies that nominally endorse monogamous marriage, significant rates of extra-pair mating are frequently documented. Genetic paternity testing, applied in various contexts, consistently uncovers discrepancies between social and biological fatherhood, often ranging from single-digit percentages to over 10% or even 20% in specific populations, challenging the assumption of universal sexual exclusivity. These patterns suggest behavioral tendencies that extend beyond the confines of a strictly monogamous model. From an evolutionary perspective, this complexity arises from differing, often conflicting, reproductive strategies shaped by natural and sexual selection. Human reproductive biology involves significant asymmetries in minimum obligatory parental investment. Females bear the substantial costs of internal gestation, lactation, and primary infant care, limiting their potential reproductive rate. Males, in contrast, have a theoretically much higher potential reproductive rate, constrained primarily by access to fertile mates. This asymmetry creates different selective pressures. For males, opportunities for extra-pair mating presented a potential pathway to increase reproductive success with relatively low marginal investment beyond sperm. Consequently, selection favored psychological traits associated with seeking mating opportunities and mate guarding. For females, while securing a reliable investing partner is often paramount, extra-pair mating could potentially offer genetic benefits, e.g., mating with males possessing indicators of superior genetic quality, material resources from additional partners, or insurance against partner infertility or abandonment. These strategies are not conscious calculations but reflect underlying motivational and emotional systems shaped over deep time. The implications of this evolutionary legacy are significant and often uncomfortable. Recognizing that lifelong sexual exclusivity is not the effortless biological default does not invalidate monogamy as a valuable social arrangement. Monogamous pair bonding offers stability, resource pooling, and effective biparental care, contributing to individual well-being and social structure. However, the ideal often exists in tension with these deeper biological predispositions. This tension manifests in the powerful and nearly universal experiences of sexual jealousy, a primary emotional defense mechanism against potential loss of investment or genetic cuckoldry. It fuels the complex psychology surrounding infidelity, where powerful desires can conflict with social commitments and personal ideals, often leading to profound emotional distress and relationship breakdowns. The cultural narrative of monogamy as the sole natural state can create unrealistic expectations and exacerbate feelings of failure or inadequacy when individuals experience attractions or impulses inconsistent with the ideal. Our cultural norms frequently represent a conscious effort to manage, channel, or suppress these underlying tendencies for social cohesion and child-rearing efficiency, rather than a simple reflection of an uncomplicated biological instinct. The challenge lies in reconciling the undeniable human capacity for deep attachment and commitment within pair bonds with the evidence for facultative mating strategies operating beneath the surface. This biological reality does not dictate behavior. Humans possess the cognitive capacity for self-regulation, foresight, and adherence to cultural norms and personal vows. Nevertheless, ignoring the evolutionary underpinnings provides an incomplete understanding of human mating psychology. It overlooks the roots of persistent conflicts, the emotional intensity surrounding fidelity, and the statistical frequency of behaviors deviating from the monogamous ideal across diverse societies. Acknowledging this complexity offers a more realistic, albeit less romantically idealized, foundation for understanding human relationships, suggesting that successful long-term partnerships often involve continuous negotiation, mutual understanding, and conscious effort to align behavior with chosen commitments, rather than relying solely on an assumed monolithic instinct for exclusivity. This intricate dance between biology and culture extends beyond mating, deeply influencing the fundamental bonds of kinship that structure human societies. The calculus of attraction. The notion that physical attractiveness is purely subjective, a product of individual whim or transient cultural trends, offers a comforting narrative of egalitarian appreciation. However, research grounded in evolutionary anthropology and psychology presents a less arbitrary and more unsettling reality. Human perceptions of beauty, while exhibiting cultural variation in details, reveal deep underlying patterns shaped by natural and sexual selection. These patterns function as evolved mechanisms for assessing potential mates, prioritizing cues that historically correlated with health, fertility, genetic quality, and the ability to provide resources or protection. The experience of attraction, therefore, is less a matter of free aesthetic choice and more the outcome of an ancient, unconscious calculus designed to enhance reproductive success. Across diverse cultures and historical periods, specific physical characteristics consistently emerge as markers of attractiveness. Bilateral symmetry, the degree to which one side of the face or body mirrors the other, is a prime example. Significant asymmetry often results from developmental stressors, such as disease, malnutrition, or genetic mutations, during critical growth periods. Consequently, symmetry evolved as a reliable, though imperfect, indicator of an individual's ability to withstand environmental challenges, suggesting robust health and a well-functioning genome. Similarly, clear, unblemished skin is consistently preferred. Skin condition serves as a visible signal of current health, parasite load, and immune system competence. Features associated with youthfulness, such as facial structure and skin elasticity, are also potent attractors, particularly in judgments of female beauty, as they correlate strongly with peak reproductive years. Sex-specific markers further illustrate this evolved calculus. In women, a relatively low waist-to-hip ratio, WHR, a narrower waist compared to wider hips, is a cross-culturally robust predictor of perceived attractiveness. This specific body fat distribution pattern is linked to higher levels of certain hormones, like estrogen, and correlates with greater fertility, lower risks of major diseases, and potentially a healthier pregnancy. Preferences for certain facial features, like large eyes and full lips, also align with neotenous, youthful characteristics associated with higher estrogen levels. For men, indicators of physical formidability and resource acquisition potential tend to dominate. Height, broad shoulders, a relatively high shoulder-to-waist ratio, indicating upper body muscle mass, and facial features signaling higher testosterone levels, such as a pronounced jawline and prominent brow ridge, are frequently found attractive. These traits historically signaled greater ability to compete with other males, provide protection, and secure resources, crucial factors for offspring survival in ancestral environments. Vocal characteristics like lower-pitched voices in men also correlate with perceived dominance and formidability. The implications of this evolved attraction calculus are profound and often uncomfortable. It creates inherent, biologically rooted inequalities in mating opportunities. Individuals possessing a greater number of these ancestrally relevant cues typically experience greater initial attraction and more mating options. Conversely, those lacking these cues, regardless of their other qualities, face greater challenges in the mating arena. The pain associated with perceived unattractiveness, therefore, is not merely a social slight. It taps into a deep-seated evolutionary anxiety about reproductive exclusion and the potential failure to pass on one's genes. This fundamental biological reality underlies much of the social dynamics surrounding dating, mate choice, and self-esteem. Furthermore, this evolutionary legacy fuels immense global industries dedicated to manipulating or enhancing these signals. The cosmetics industry largely focuses on mimicking cues of youth and health. Foundations and concealers create the illusion of flawless, parasite-free skin. Products enhance features like lip fullness and eyelash prominence associated with fertility. Fashion frequently emphasizes or creates the illusion of desirable body proportions, such as low WHR, through tailored clothing or waist cinctures. The fitness industry capitalizes on the drive to achieve indicators of formidability, muscle mass for men, or fertility-linked body composition for women. Perhaps most starkly, the cosmetic surgery industry directly alters anatomy to conform more closely to these evolved ideals, augmenting breasts or buttocks, reducing waists, sculpting jawlines, or correcting perceived asymmetries. The scale of these industries is a testament to the powerful, often unacknowledged, pressure exerted by our evolved mating psychology. Acknowledging the evolved nature of attraction preferences does not imply that they are immutable determinants of behavior or value. Human mate choice integrates many factors, including personality, intelligence, shared values, social status, and cultural context. Nor does it justify discrimination based on appearance. However, dismissing the biological underpinnings of attraction as mere social constructs ignores a significant driver of human experience. It obscures the origins of widespread social phenomena like appearance-based bias and the intense pressures surrounding physical presentation. Understanding the calculus of attraction provides a more complete, albeit less comforting, explanation for why certain physical ideals persist despite cultural shifts, why the pain of rejection based on looks cuts so deeply, and why vast resources are expended in the pursuit of conforming to these deeply ingrained biological signals. This relentless biological evaluation extends even into the domain of family, where the bonds of kinship are similarly shaped by unseen evolutionary pressures. Parental love, the gene's guarantor. The profound bond between parent and child is frequently described as the epitome of unconditional love, a sacred and selfless connection transcending calculation. However, evolutionary anthropology and psychology, focused on the mechanisms promoting genetic survival across deep time, present a perspective that can feel jarringly incongruent with this ideal. While the experience of parental love is undeniably powerful and deeply felt, its ultimate biological function is not metaphysical altruism, but ensuring the successful replication of parental genes through investment in offspring. Recognizing that this most cherished bond is shaped by a complex calculus of evolutionary pressures constitutes a challenging, yet important, truth about human nature. Parental love is an exquisitely evolved motivational system designed to guarantee immense investment, but its intensity and focus are not immune to subtle biological influences. The evolutionary logic underpinning parental investment is stark. Raising human offspring demands an extraordinary commitment of time, energy, resources, and emotional capital over many years. This investment is inherently risky. Resources poured into one child cannot be allocated to others, and there is no guarantee of reproductive success. Natural selection, therefore, favored the emergence of powerful emotional mechanisms, primarily parental love, to compel caregivers to undertake this costly endeavor. The overwhelming drive to nurture, protect, and sacrifice for one's child is the psychological manifestation of this adaptation, effectively ensuring that genes have a vehicle for propagation into the next generation. Without this potent emotional system, the burdens of prolonged human childhood would likely render sustained investment evolutionarily untenable. However, the evolutionary perspective suggests that this investment system, while powerful, incorporates mechanisms for calibration. Parental resources are finite, and selection pressures would have favored psychological tendencies directing investment towards offspring offering the highest probable return in terms of genetic fitness. This does not imply conscious deliberation by parents, but rather the subtle shaping of emotional responses and behavioral inclinations. Factors potentially influencing this unconscious calibration include cues of offspring viability and future potential. Parents may experience stronger attachment or allocate greater resources towards children exhibiting robust health, signs of high intelligence, or physical vigor, as these traits historically correlated with greater chances of survival and reproductive success. Conversely, investment may be more conflicted, or the emotional bond potentially less intense, towards offspring with severe congenital illnesses or disabilities perceived as drastically reducing future fitness potential. While modern medicine and ethics profoundly alter the context, the underlying psychological predispositions can still manifest in subtle biases, differential treatment, or heightened parental stress in such situations. Paternity certainty is another significant factor in this evolutionary calculus. For biological fathers, unlike mothers, genetic relatedness is never certain. Consequently, evolutionary theory predicts psychological mechanisms promoting greater investment when paternity confidence is high. One observable cue is phenotypic resemblance. Studies suggest that fathers, and sometimes other relatives, may exhibit stronger attachment or invest more in children who bear a physical resemblance to them, as this subconsciously signals genetic relatedness. Step-parents, on average, tend to invest less and exhibit higher rates of conflict and even abuse towards stepchildren compared to biological offspring, a phenomenon tragically documented in cross-cultural studies. This reflects the lack of direct genetic incentive, driving the same intensity of evolved parental investment mechanisms. Maternal grandparents, typically more certain of their genetic link to their daughter's children, often invest more consistently than paternal grandparents, where the genetic link is less certain. The implications of this evolutionary framework illuminate several painful aspects of human family life. Parental favoritism, a common and often distressing phenomenon across cultures, finds a partial explanation here. While cultural dynamics and individual personalities play roles, the unconscious calibration of investment based on perceived fitness potential or resemblance can contribute to preferential treatment. The profound, often debilitating, grief experienced by parents upon the death of a child also aligns with this view. Such a loss represents not only an emotional catastrophe, but also the catastrophic failure of a massive biological investment, the termination of a direct genetic lineage. The intensity of this grief is proportional to the magnitude of the investment lost. Conversely, grief following a miscarriage, particularly very early in pregnancy, tends to be less severe for many individuals. Evolutionary psychology suggests this reflects the lower level of tangible investment, time, energy, physical changes, already committed at that stage, compared to the loss of a child after years of nurturing. The bonding process itself is an incremental investment. Acknowledging the evolved biological foundation of parental love does not diminish its psychological reality or its profound importance for human development and well-being. The love felt is genuine. However, it reveals this love not as pure, disinterested altruism, but as a breathtakingly powerful and complex motivational system forged by natural selection to solve the critical problem of securing genetic survival through prodigious, long-term investment in offspring. It is a mechanism ensuring that genes act as the ultimate guarantor of their propagation, using the deep emotional currents of parental affection as their instrument. Understanding this origin provides a more complete, albeit less romantically idealized, explanation for the variations in parental behavior and the profound emotional weight attached to the parent-child bond. This drive to perpetuate genes underpins not only parental bonds but fundamentally shapes the intricate structures of kinship that define human social organization. Altruism's hidden ledger. The impulse to help others, particularly at a cost to oneself, is often celebrated as a hallmark of human virtue and a counterargument to a purely mechanistic view of nature. However, evolutionary analysis challenges the simplicity of this narrative, suggesting that the psychological roots of altruism are deeply entangled with strategies for genetic and individual survival. The uncomfortable truth is that behaviors appearing selfless on the surface frequently align with evolutionary models that calculate indirect benefits to the actor or their kin. This perspective does not negate the positive outcomes of helping behavior, but questions the existence of pure, disinterested altruism as a widespread biological phenomenon. Understanding the evolved mechanisms behind kindness provides a more sobering, yet scientifically robust, explanation for why we help and whom we choose to assist. The dominant evolutionary theories explaining altruism are kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Kin selection, often summarized by the concept of inclusive fitness, posits that altruistic behavior can evolve if it benefits the survival and reproduction of an individual's genetic relatives. Since relatives share a proportion of identical genes, aiding a relative's success indirectly promotes the replication of one's genes. This theory predicts, and empirical evidence strongly supports, that the strength of the altruistic impulse correlates directly with the degree of genetic relatedness. Parents routinely make extraordinary sacrifices for their children, siblings support each other, and the willingness to help diminishes as cousins become more distant. The urge to protect and provide for kin is not a conscious genetic calculation, but a powerful evolved emotional drive that served as a highly effective strategy for gene propagation. Reciprocal altruism explains helping behavior between unrelated individuals. This model involves an individual incurring a cost to provide a benefit to another, with the expectation, often implicit and unconscious, that the favor will be returned in the future. For this to be a stable evolutionary strategy, participants must be able to recognize each other, remember past interactions, and punish cheaters who accept benefits but fail to reciprocate. This system of calculated exchange, operating over deep time, forged psychological traits like gratitude, guilt, and a sense of obligation, which serve to regulate these reciprocal relationships. The human propensity to form friendships and alliances is largely built upon this framework of delayed, mutually beneficial exchange. Helping a colleague with a project or sharing resources with a neighbor creates a social debt, strengthening bonds and building a network of cooperation that enhances the survival prospects of all participants. Truly costly altruism directed towards strangers with absolutely no possibility of reciprocation or any form of benefit to the actor or their kin presents a significant evolutionary puzzle. Such acts are statistically rare and often subject to alternative interpretations. For instance, a dramatic act like diving into a raging river to save an unknown person may appear purely selfless. However, evolutionary psychology suggests that even here, hidden benefits may exist. The altruist may receive a substantial boost to their reputation within the community, signaling themselves as a courageous and cooperative partner, which can lead to long-term social and material rewards. Alternatively, the act may be driven by an overpowering aversive response to witnessing distress, a psychological mechanism that evolved to maintain group cohesion and which, when acted upon, provides the actor with the internal reward of relieved anxiety or a sense of having done the right thing, reinforcing the behavior for future instances. The implications of this evolutionary framework are significant. It challenges romantic notions of pure, disinterested virtue, suggesting that even our kindest impulses are channeled through psychological adaptations shaped by self-interest, broadly defined in genetic terms. This does not diminish the social value of acts of kindness, but it reframes their origin. It explains why helping behavior feels subjectively rewarding. Evolution has incentivized it by linking it to positive emotional states, whether through the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled, the joy of a loved one's success, or the pride of an enhanced reputation. It also provides a clear, if uncomfortable, explanation for the biases in our altruism. We are instinctively more likely to help those who look like us, sound like us, or share our cultural background because, in our ancestral past, these were reliable indicators of being part of the same cooperative group or even distant kin. Conversely, we are less moved by the plight of distant strangers, as our evolved psychology is not calibrated for the global scale of modern media. And who is us? The lines we draw between us and them run deep, etched by ancient competition for resources and reproductive success. This fundamental distinction, rooted in the very mechanisms of kin-based and reciprocal altruism, governs not only whom we help but also whom we trust, whom we fear, and ultimately, whom we are willing to sacrifice for or against. Tribalism, the in-group imperative. From intense sports rivalries to entrenched political polarization and intergroup violence, the human propensity to form coalitions and exhibit strong preferential treatment towards one's group is a pervasive and often destructive force. This tendency is frequently attributed to learned prejudice or cultural indoctrination alone. However, an evolutionary perspective reveals a more unsettling truth. Tribalism is a foundational element of human social psychology, a deeply ingrained adaptation that was essential for survival in our ancestral past. The mental machinery that divides the world into us and them and encourages suspicion of outsiders is not a modern aberration, but a core feature of our evolved minds, making its influence both powerful and difficult to eradicate. The evolutionary logic for this in-group/out-group psychology is rooted in the intense group-based competition that characterized human prehistory. For our ancestors, survival and reproductive success were almost entirely contingent upon membership in a cohesive, cooperative band. This group provided collective defense against predators and rival bands, enabled large-game hunting, and facilitated the sharing of resources to buffer against scarcity. In this context, traits that fostered strong within-group cohesion and effective between-group competition were strongly favored by natural selection. Psychologically, this meant evolving a suite of instincts that promoted altruism, trust, and generosity towards in-group members, while simultaneously encouraging wariness, distrust, and hostility towards outgroups. Demonizing or dehumanizing outsiders served a clear adaptive function. It reduced the cognitive dissonance of harming others, strengthened internal bonds through shared opposition, and motivated individuals to contribute to group defense and aggression. The cost of being overly trusting of an outsider, who could be a threat, a competitor for scarce resources, or a carrier of novel pathogens, far outweighed the cost of being overly suspicious. The implications of this ancient wiring are evident across all levels of modern human society, often with devastating consequences. This innate predisposition is the fundamental substrate upon which modern phenomena like racism, ethnocentrism, extreme nationalism, and religious intolerance are built. While the specific ideologies and targets are culturally defined, the underlying psychological engine, the drive to favor the in-group and disfavor the out-group, is a biological constant. It fuels political polarization, where political affiliations become tribal identities and policy disagreements transform into moral crusades against a malevolent opposition. It manifests in more mundane forms, such as corporate departmental rivalries or cliquish behavior in social settings. Crucially, this process operates largely unconsciously. The cognitive shortcuts that quickly categorize people into in-group and out-group, and the subsequent biases in empathy and trust, are automatic and intuitive, not the product of deliberate rational thought. Consequently, overcoming these deeply rooted tribal impulses requires immense and constant conscious effort. It is not a matter of simply choosing to be unbiased. Our default cognitive settings are to prefer those who are similar to us, to trust familiar faces, and to be skeptical of those perceived as different. Effective strategies for mitigating tribalism, such as the pursuit of superordinate goals, where disparate groups must cooperate to achieve a common objective, or structured, equal status contact between groups, are effective precisely because they work against our natural inclinations. They are deliberate interventions designed to short-circuit an ancient and automatic psychological process. They force the cognitive system to recategorize individuals from a rival outgroup into a larger, more inclusive in-group, a mental effort that does not come naturally. This is why progress in intergroup relations is often fragile and reversible. It is a hard-won cultural achievement that must be continually reinforced against the persistent pull of our evolutionary default. Tribalism is thus the dark flip side of humanity's greatest strength, our profound capacity for cooperation. The same psychological adaptations that allow for unprecedented levels of trust, collaboration, and altruism within a group are intrinsically linked to the potential for prejudice, distrust, and violence towards those outside of it. We are a species that can build charitable organizations and commit genocide, often driven by the same underlying imperative to protect and promote the interests of the we against the they. Acknowledging this inherent tribalism is not an excuse for prejudice, but a necessary first step in addressing it. It reveals that the challenge is not merely about changing opinions or policies, but about consciously managing a fundamental and powerful aspect of our evolved nature. The walls within our minds were built for a world that no longer exists, yet they continue to shape the architecture of our conflicts. Violence, an ancient tool. A common modern perspective frames violence as a pathology, a breakdown of social order resulting from poverty, ideology, or individual psychopathy. This view offers the comforting implication that a well-ordered society could eventually eradicate it. However, evidence from archaeology, anthropology, and primatology converges on a far more unsettling conclusion. The capacity for violence, particularly among males, is a deeply embedded element of our evolutionary heritage, a strategic tool that provided significant advantages in the ancestral environments where human psychology was forged. Acknowledging that violent impulses are not merely a cultural artifact, but a potential deeply woven into our biology, is a difficult yet necessary step toward addressing their pervasive presence in human societies across time and space. The archaeological record provides tangible, albeit fragmented, evidence of humanity's violent past. Prehistoric human remains frequently show signs of traumatic injury consistent with interpersonal conflict. A notable example is the discovery of a Neolithic mass grave at Talheim, Germany, where the skeletons of men, women, and children show lethal blows from stone axes, suggesting the complete annihilation of one community by another. Similarly, the skeleton of Kennewick Man, from North America, exhibits a projectile point embedded in his pelvis. While such finds do not indicate constant warfare, they demonstrate that lethal group conflict was a recurrent feature of prehistoric life, not a modern invention. This evidence contradicts the notion of a peaceful prehistoric era, instead pointing to a reality where violent death was an ever-present risk. Observational studies of historical and contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, which offer the closest analogies to ancestral human conditions, further dispel the myth of innate peacefulness. Anthropological data compiled from various foraging groups reveal alarmingly high rates of death by violence. In some of these societies, the percentage of male deaths attributable to warfare, raiding, and homicide reaches double digits, a rate that rivals or even exceeds that of many modern nations during wartime. These conflicts were typically driven by competition for critical resources, productive land, hunting territories, and water sources, as well as by revenge killings and the abduction of women. Violence was not a random act but a calculated, albeit often brutal, strategy for securing survival and reproductive advantages. The successful execution of a raid could eliminate rivals, acquire new assets, and elevate a male's status within his group, thereby increasing his access to mates. This behavioral pattern finds a disturbing parallel in our closest evolutionary relatives, chimpanzees. Primatologists have documented that chimpanzee males engage in coordinated, lethal aggression against males from neighboring communities. These patrols and attacks function to expand their territory, thereby gaining access to more food resources, and to reduce the threat posed by rival males. They also engage in the forcible acquisition of females. This evidence suggests that the roots of intergroup coalitionary violence in humans are ancient, predating the emergence of culture as we know it. It points to a shared evolutionary history where coalitional aggression conferred a selective advantage. The implication of this combined evidence is not that humans are inevitably violent or that warfare is justified. Rather, it is that the psychological potential for violence is a fundamental part of our biological makeup. It is natural in the strict sense that the neural circuits, hormonal responses, like testosterone and adrenaline, and cognitive biases that facilitate aggressive behavior were shaped by natural selection because they were effective in solving recurrent adaptive problems. These problems included acquiring resources, eliminating competitors, achieving social dominance, deterring threats from rivals, and controlling female reproduction. This potential is activated or suppressed by specific environmental conditions, such as intense competition, perceived scarcity, a lack of effective deterrence, or the dehumanization of an outgroup. Understanding these deep evolutionary roots is crucial for any effective strategy aimed at preventing violence. To treat violence solely as a cultural or ideological product is to ignore its powerful biological underpinnings. This recognition forces a more realistic approach. Effective prevention requires more than just improving economic conditions or education, though these are important. It necessitates constructing robust social and legal institutions that credibly deter aggression and make violence a costly and unattractive strategy. It requires consciously fostering norms that inhibit our tribalistic and aggressive impulses and promoting conflict resolution mechanisms that channel competition into non-lethal arenas. The goal is not to deny this aspect of our nature, but to create environments where this ancient tool remains sheathed, managed by the conscious application of the very reason that also evolved to serve our survival. This sobering recognition of our own shadow complicates the narrative of human progress, suggesting that our highest achievements in cooperation and morality exist in a perpetual tension with our innate capacity for aggression. This internal conflict between deep-seated instinct and conscious choice leads to a final, fundamental question about the nature of human agency itself. Sex differences beyond the social. The discourse on psychological differences between men and women is often polarized between two extreme positions. One that attributes all variation to social construction and conditioning, and another that relies on rigid, often harmful, stereotypes. Evolutionary psychology introduces a challenging, evidence-based middle path that acknowledges the role of culture while insisting on the profound influence of deep evolutionary history. This perspective posits that, due to vastly different reproductive constraints and opportunities over millions of years, men and women have evolved distinct psychological adaptations. These adaptations result in statistically significant average differences in a range of domains, from mate selection to social behavior. Acknowledging these patterns, which are observable across cultures and have roots in our biology, is a difficult but necessary step for a complete understanding of human nature, even as we affirm the fundamental equality and potential of every individual. The foundation of these divergent evolutionary paths is anisogamy, the difference in the size and investment of gametes. Women produce a limited number of large, metabolically costly eggs and bear the immense biological burdens of internal gestation, childbirth, and lactation. This creates a high minimum investment in any offspring. Men, in contrast, produce a vast quantity of small, cheap sperm, and their minimum biological investment can be negligible. This fundamental asymmetry launched a cascade of different selective pressures. For women, The primary adaptive challenges involve the careful selection of mates who could provide high-quality genetic contributions, signaled by health and symmetry, and crucially, tangible resources and long-term commitment to support the extended period of offspring dependency. A poor mate choice carried catastrophic costs. For men, the primary challenge was not a scarcity of fertile partners, but intense competition with other males for reproductive access. Their reproductive success was less constrained by the biological clock of pregnancy and more by their ability to outcompete rivals and attract mates. This led to a different set of selective pressures favoring traits associated with competitive prowess, risk-taking to achieve status and resources, and a greater openness to short-term mating opportunities, as these presented a low-cost chance to increase reproductive output. These differing ancestral selection pressures are not conscious drivers, but the historical forces that sculpted the underlying psychological mechanisms we observe today. Consequently, research reveals consistent, cross-cultural average differences in several key areas. Mate preferences, while showing significant overlap in desires for kindness and intelligence, diverge in predictable ways. Men, on average, place a higher premium on signals of youth and physical health, e.g., specific waist-to-hip ratios, clear skin, cues to fertility and reproductive value. Women, on average, place a greater weight on a potential mate's status, resources, and ambition, indicators of their ability to provide and invest, as well as on traits signaling a willingness to commit, such as emotional maturity and dependability. These differences in strategy are further reflected in jealousy. Studies consistently show that men, on average, exhibit a stronger physiological and emotional reaction to sexual infidelity, which risks cuckoldry and investment in another male's offspring, while women, on average, react more strongly to emotional infidelity, which risks the diversion of a partner's commitment and resources to a rival. Beyond mating, these divergent pressures shaped other psychological tendencies. Physical aggression, a high-risk strategy with high potential payoff in male competition, is observed at significantly higher rates in males across all human societies and in childhood, preceding strong cultural indoctrination. Women, however, tend to employ more relational or indirect aggression, which is less physically risky and more focused on damaging a rival's social standing. Men also consistently demonstrate a higher propensity for risky and sensation-seeking behaviors, which in ancestral contexts could have led to gains in status and resources. Even in spatial cognition, average differences in navigation strategies, men favoring orientation by cardinal directions and geometric cues, women favoring landmarks, are theorized to link to a division of labor involving large game hunting, requiring long-distance travel, versus foraging and gathering near a home base. The implications of this are profound. Denying the existence of these average differences, for fear of reinforcing stereotypes, ultimately hinders a scientific understanding of human behavior, relationships, and societal organization. It leaves us unable to adequately explain persistent patterns in career choices, friendship dynamics, consumer behavior, and the nature of interpersonal conflict. Recognizing these tendencies is not an endorsement of biological determinism. It does not mean that all men or all women conform to the average, nor does it say anything about the value, potential, or rightful place of any individual within society. Culture can amplify, diminish, or channel these underlying dispositions in countless ways. However, to ignore the deep-seated roots of these patterns is to ignore a significant part of the explanatory puzzle. It is to build a science of human behavior on an incomplete foundation, one that fails to account for the divergent paths carved by evolution, which have left an indelible imprint on the minds of men and women. This acceptance of a biologically influenced human nature, complex and often uncomfortable, forces a final reckoning with the very notion of free will and the extent to which we are truly the architects of our desires and destinies. Status, the invisible currency. The desire for respect, recognition, and a favorable position within a social hierarchy is a universal and powerful human motive. It is often dismissed as vanity or superficial ego-seeking, but its roots run far deeper than cultural conditioning. From an evolutionary perspective, the pursuit of status is not a luxury. It was a critical component of survival and reproductive fitness in the small-scale, interdependent groups that characterized most of human history. The intense emotional weight we attach to social evaluation, the visceral pain of humiliation, the potent satisfaction of praise, is the legacy of an evolutionary past where one's standing within the group directly determined access to the necessities of life. Understanding status as a fundamental, evolved drive provides a clearer, if less flattering, lens through which to view a vast range of human behaviors, from ambition and consumption to anxiety and social conflict. In the ancestral environments where human psychology was forged, existence was precarious and resources were often scarce. Social groups were the primary source of security, but these groups were internally stratified. An individual's position in this hierarchy had profound consequences. High-status individuals enjoyed preferential access to the highest quality food, the safest positions within the group, the most capable allies, and the most desirable mating opportunities. For males, status was often a primary determinant of reproductive success, with leaders and skilled hunters having greater access to partners. For females, status could translate into better protection for oneself and one's offspring, as well as greater influence over group decisions. Conversely, low status meant receiving the leftovers, being more exposed to danger on the periphery of the group, having fewer defenders in a dispute, and being a less attractive partner. In this context, a drop in social standing was not merely an emotional blow. It represented a direct and serious threat to one's well-being and genetic legacy. Natural selection, therefore, sculpted a sophisticated mental apparatus dedicated to navigating the social landscape. The human brain is exquisitely designed to be a status-tracking device. It operates with a relentless, often subconscious, focus on monitoring our position relative to others, deciphering complex social cues, and calculating the potential status implications of our actions and the actions of those around us. We are highly attuned to signs of deference and disrespect, to subtle shifts in alliance structures, and to opportunities for elevating our standing. The emotional system is tightly wired to this machinery. Achieving a status boost triggers reward circuits, producing feelings of pride and confidence, while experiencing a status threat activates stress and anxiety systems, generating feelings of shame, anger, or envy. These are not arbitrary emotions. They are adaptive pushes and pulls, motivating behaviors that would have maintained or improved one's position in the critical social hierarchy. The implications of this ingrained drive are evident in nearly every facet of modern life. The relentless pursuit of career advancement, academic achievement, and artistic acclaim is, at its core, a pursuit of status in a contemporary guise. Consumerism is fueled not only by material need, but also by the use of luxury goods as costly signals of wealth and success, a modern form of a peacock's tail. Much political maneuvering, within both governments and corporations, is a raw struggle for dominance and influence within a hierarchy. Even acts of philanthropy and public generosity, while producing genuine good, can also function as powerful displays of resources, enhancing the donor's status and reputation. The intense pain of social rejection or public humiliation makes sense in this light. It is not an overreaction but an evolved alarm system signaling a potential collapse in one's social capital, triggering a deep-seated anxiety that echoes ancestral fears of ostracism and its dire consequences. Nowhere is the hijacking of this ancient circuitry more apparent than in the rise of social media. These platforms are effectively supernormal stimuli for the status-seeking mind. They provide a quantified, public, and constant stream of social feedback in the form of likes, shares, followers, and comments. This delivers intermittent reinforcement, a powerful psychological reward mechanism. Every time a post receives validation, directly tapping into the brain's reward pathways that evolved to celebrate a rise in social standing. Conversely, A lack of engagement or negative feedback can feel like a public demotion, triggering outsized anxiety and depression. The compulsive checking, the careful curation of an online persona, and the envy generated by viewing the highlight reels of others' lives are all modern manifestations of an ancient, relentless drive to monitor and elevate our position in the tribe. Status is the invisible currency that our brains are wired to accumulate, and much of human culture is the complex market where it is earned and spent. The illusion of free will. The subjective experience of being human is characterized by a profound sense of agency. We feel ourselves to be the authors of our thoughts and the architects of our actions, consciously weighing options before making a deliberate choice. This feeling of autonomous free will is foundational to our concepts of self, morality, and legal responsibility. However, a convergence of evidence from neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and evolutionary theory presents a deeply challenging counter-narrative. It suggests that our conscious mind is not the omnipotent captain, but more akin to a spokesperson, offering after-the-fact explanations for decisions initiated by unconscious processes. This view does not deny consciousness, but radically redefines its role, proposing that the biological machinery driving our behavior operates largely outside its purview, constrained by imperatives we did not choose. The human brain is not a unified, rational command center, but a collection of specialized, evolved modules, complex neural circuits shaped by natural selection to solve specific adaptive problems of our ancestral past. These systems, governing everything from threat detection and mate preference to social exchange and food aversion, operate with a high degree of autonomy. They process vast amounts of sensory and internal data, generate emotional responses, and initiate behaviors without requiring or seeking conscious approval. For instance, the instantaneous flinch away from a sudden loud noise, the gut feeling of distrust towards a stranger, or the surge of attraction towards a potential mate are all outputs of these automated systems. Consciousness is often informed of these decisions only after they have been made, tasked not with initiation, but with interpretation. This model is supported by a body of experimental evidence. Neuroscientific studies using functional MRI have demonstrated that brain activity associated with a simple motor decision, such as moving a finger, can be detected several seconds before the individual becomes consciously aware of making that choice. The conscious experience of deciding appears to be a subsequent event in a chain of neural processes that began unconsciously. Similarly, research on split-brain patients whose cerebral hemispheres have been surgically separated shows that when the nonverbal right brain is prompted to act, the verbal, conscious left brain will immediately fabricate a plausible but entirely incorrect reason for why the action was taken. This reveals a compelling capacity for post hoc rationalization, where the conscious mind generates a logical-sounding narrative to explain behavior whose true origins remain hidden from it. From an evolutionary standpoint, this arrangement is highly efficient. Consciousness is computationally expensive and slow. Relying on it to micromanage every life-or-death decision, from predator avoidance to assessing a social threat, would be maladaptive. Instead, natural selection favored a system where rapid, automated, and emotion-laden circuits handle the bulk of processing, freeing conscious attention for more abstract planning and social communication. Our will is thus not a primary cause but a compelling feeling that emerges from this complex interplay. It is directed and constrained by biological imperatives, the drive for status, the avoidance of danger, the pursuit of mates, that were encoded into our neural architecture by the blind process of natural selection long before we were born. The implications of this perspective are disquieting and force a reevaluation of deeply held beliefs. It challenges the foundational premises of our systems of justice and moral responsibility, which are predicated on the idea of a freely choosing moral agent. If conscious control is an illusion, the concepts of blame and merit require significant rethinking, shifting focus from pure retribution toward a more causative understanding of behavior that considers the biological and environmental factors shaping unconscious drives. On a personal level, It undermines the notion of a unitary, sovereign self, suggesting instead that what we experience as the self is a fragile narrative woven from the outputs of countless competing neural subsystems. However, recognizing the illusion is not a descent into nihilism, but a potential path to greater self-awareness and effective self-regulation. If we understand that our impulses, biases, and emotional reactions are often the product of ancient circuitry, not designed for modern life, we can learn to anticipate them. Strategies for change become less about sheer willpower and more about designing our environments and habits to shape the unconscious inputs that guide our actions. It encourages intellectual humility, as we recognize that our most cherished convictions may be elaborate justifications for positions we did not rationally choose. Ultimately, this view expands our understanding of human behavior by forcing us to look beyond the convincing story told by the narrator in our heads and to acknowledge the powerful, unseen currents of our evolved biology that truly steer the ship. Designed for DNA, not delight. The pursuit of happiness is a central tenet of modern life, often considered an inalienable right and the ultimate goal of human striving. This quest feels inherently purposeful, as if achieving a state of sustained contentment is the point of our existence. However, an evolutionary perspective reveals a stark and disconcerting truth. Natural selection is entirely indifferent to our subjective well-being. The psychological mechanisms that govern pleasure and pain were not shaped to deliver lasting happiness, but to serve a single, relentless purpose: the successful replication of our genes. Our inner emotional world is not designed for fulfillment, but for functionality, a system of carrots and sticks engineered to propel adaptive behavior, not to grant us peace. The transient nature of pleasure is a feature of this system, not a flaw. Pleasure is an effective but short-lived reward signal. Its fleeting quality is crucial because sustained satisfaction would extinguish the motivation to act. If acquiring a resource, achieving a status milestone, or securing a mate produced permanent euphoria, there would be no impetus to seek more, to improve one's position, or to guard against loss. This is why the joy of a promotion fades, the new car becomes ordinary, and the thrill of a new relationship settles into routine. Evolution employs pleasure as a temporary incentive, a brief neurological pat on the back for engaging in reproductively advantageous behavior. Once the goal is achieved, the feeling dissipates to make way for the next desire, the next anxiety, the next drive. This ensures a constant state of striving, which, in our ancestral environment, directly correlated with increased survival and reproductive odds. Conversely, negative emotional states like anxiety, dissatisfaction, and envy are powerful and persistent motivators. The pain of low status, the fear of scarcity, the gnawing worry about the future, these are not mere malfunctions of the mind. They are evolved goads, compelling us to rectify a deficit, avoid a threat, or compete more effectively. A contented hominid was likely a vulnerable one. A hominid restless with ambition and vigilant against potential losses was far more likely to thrive and leave descendants. Our brains are therefore engineered with a strong negativity bias, preferentially processing and remembering threats and slights, as these were more critical for survival than savoring successes. This background hum of low-grade dissatisfaction is the default state that keeps us engaged in the struggle for resources and status. Positive moods, while sought after, are themselves signals tied to specific evolutionary metrics, not to abstract well-being. The surge of pride after a social victory reinforces status-seeking behavior. The deep contentment felt while providing for one's family reinforces parental investment. The exhilaration of romantic love facilitates pair bonding. These are all positive states, but they are tethered to fitness-related outcomes. They are the rewards for meeting an evolutionary KPI, not the goal of a life well lived in the modern sense. Lasting, unalloyed happiness, a state of pure, context-free contentment, was never the objective. From a gene's eye view, an individual who achieved such a state would be an evolutionary dead end, having lost the very drives that compel action, competition, and reproduction. The implications of this design are profound and visible in the core frustrations of modern life. It provides the biological substrate for the hedonic treadmill, the well-documented phenomenon whereby humans quickly adapt to positive improvements in their circumstances, returning to a baseline level of happiness and then desiring more. A raise, a larger home, or any material gain provides only a temporary spike in pleasure before the new standard becomes the norm and ambition shifts to the next goal. This explains why increases in material wealth and comfort beyond a basic threshold of security show remarkably weak correlations with long-term increases in happiness. We are chasing proxies for evolutionary success, wealth, status, attractiveness, under the mistaken assumption that attaining them will yield the lasting fulfillment our system was never built to provide. Our pursuit of happiness is often a misdirected attempt to satiate ancient drives in a world that has radically changed. We consume to simulate resource acquisition, seek fame as a proxy for tribal status, and navigate a world of abundant yet shallow social connections, while our brains are calibrated for the deep, interdependent bonds of a small band. Understanding that we are designed for DNA, not delight, is not a counsel for despair. It is a call for clear-eyed self-awareness. It suggests that if lasting contentment is to be found, it may lie not in the relentless pursuit of evolutionary carrots, more money, more status, more novelty, but in activities that circumvent or calm these ancient drives: mindfulness, compassion, gratitude, and deep social connection. These are not the system's primary commands, but perhaps the ways we can learn to operate the machinery for ends beyond its original, narrow programming. Discrimination, an ancient algorithm. Modern ethical frameworks rightly condemn prejudice in its various forms: racism, sexism, xenophobia, nepotism, as profound moral failings and destructive forces within societies. This condemnation, however, often carries an implicit assumption that these biases are solely products of ignorance, malevolence, or flawed cultural indoctrination. An evolutionary perspective reveals a more unsettling and complex origin. The roots of discriminatory behavior are not merely modern inventions. They are the remnants of a suite of ancient cognitive shortcuts that were once highly adaptive for survival and reproduction in the small-scale, perilous world of our ancestors. Understanding that these tendencies are deep-seated psychological defaults, rather than purely learned ideologies, is a difficult but necessary step toward addressing them effectively. The ancestral environment presented a constant stream of life-or-death decisions that had to be made with limited information and under time pressure. In this context, evolution favored mental shortcuts, heuristics that promoted quick, efficient judgments, prioritizing survival over perfect accuracy. These heuristics form the foundational algorithm for much of what we now identify as discrimination. The most fundamental of these is nepotism, the predisposition to favor kin. From a genetic standpoint, helping a relative is a way of supporting copies of one's genes. This principle of inclusive fitness ensured that resources, protection, and support were directed toward those who shared a common genetic interest, a strategy that directly enhanced an individual's evolutionary success. This innate tendency to prioritize family is not a cultural artifact, but a biological imperative that underpins the simplest forms of in-group bias. Expanding beyond immediate kin, the same logic applied to the broader in-group, the band or tribe. Survival was contingent upon tight cooperation and a high degree of trust among members. Favoring those within one's group, who were known and who operated under shared norms and reciprocal obligations, was a prudent strategy for navigating a dangerous world. This in-group favoritism fostered the cohesion and mutual aid necessary for collective defense, hunting, and resource sharing. Conversely, interactions without groups were fraught with uncertainty. Strangers could be competitors for scarce resources, carriers of novel diseases to which the group had no immunity, or members of a hostile faction. A default stance of wariness, avoidance, or preemptive aggression toward those outside the group, a tendency we now label xenophobia, was often a matter of survival. The cost of being overly trusting of an outsider was potentially catastrophic, while the cost of being overly suspicious was typically much lower. Physical characteristics served as the most readily available and instantly processed proxies for categorizing others. In an ancestral world where people rarely encountered individuals who looked dramatically different from their immediate group, phenotypic similarity, skin color, facial features, body type, became a crude but efficient marker for assumed kinship and shared group membership. Preference for those who looked like us was a rough heuristic for identifying likely allies and kin. Conversely, differences in appearance triggered ancient alarm bells, automatically flagging an individual as a potential member of an outgroup and thus a potential threat. This ingrained preference for similarity and wariness of difference is the deep cognitive substrate upon which modern racism and ethnic prejudice are built, though they are now articulated through complex and pernicious cultural ideologies. The implications of this evolutionary history are critical for developing effective strategies to combat discrimination. It demonstrates that these biases are not simply the product of a few bad apples or easily erased misconceptions. They are the default settings of a mind shaped by a world that no longer exists. In today's vast, interconnected, and multicultural societies, these ancient algorithms consistently misfire. The stranger from a different ethnic background is far more likely to be a colleague or neighbor than a lethal threat. Basing hiring or promotion on familial ties, nepotism, corrupts meritocracy and undermines large-scale social institutions. This perspective does not excuse discriminatory behavior. Rather, it clarifies the magnitude of the challenge. It shifts the focus from merely attributing blame to individuals to understanding the powerful, subconscious currents that must be consciously overcome. Combating these ingrained tendencies, therefore, requires more than just moral exhortation or individual resolve. It necessitates the deliberate design of system-level solutions that anticipate and correct for these predictable cognitive failures. Blind recruitment processes that hide demographic information, structured interviews with standardized questions, and policies that enforce transparency in decision-making are all examples of creating environments where ancient heuristics cannot easily operate. Recognizing the deep evolutionary roots of bias is not an argument for acquiescence, but a call for a more realistic and systematic approach to building a just society. It acknowledges that our higher moral aspirations must constantly contend with an ancient psychology designed for a different world, and that progress depends on creating structures that help our better angels prevail. Life's brutal cradle. A persistent and seductive narrative portrays the existence of pre-agricultural humans as one of primal innocence, a peaceful, egalitarian, and ecologically harmonious state from which modern society has fallen. This idealization, often traced to Rousseau's concept of the noble savage, offers a compelling critique of contemporary ills but fundamentally misrepresents the archaeological and anthropological evidence. The reality of life for our foraging ancestors was one of profound hardship, constant threat, and high mortality. Their world was not a utopia lost, but a demanding crucible in which the very elements of human nature we struggle with today, tribalism, violence, and inequality, were forged as essential adaptations to a brutal existence. Acknowledging this stark reality is necessary for understanding the origins of our psychology and for properly evaluating the true benefits and costs of modern civilization. The notion of pervasive peace is sharply contradicted by evidence of widespread interpersonal violence. Analysis of prehistoric human remains reveals a grim record of trauma. Mass graves, such as those at Naderich in Kenya or Talheim in Germany, provide unambiguous evidence of coordinated lethal violence, including executions and lethal projectile wounds. Studies of skeletal remains from various prehistoric sites consistently show that a significant percentage of deaths, particularly among men, resulted from weapon-related injuries. While not indicative of constant warfare, this evidence points to frequent, lethal intergroup raiding and conflict over resources, women, and territory. This pattern is corroborated by ethnographic studies of historically documented hunter-gatherer societies which often exhibit homicide rates far exceeding those of modern industrialized nations. Violence was not an anomaly. It was a recurrent and significant feature of the human condition. Beyond the threat of conflict, daily life was characterized by extreme vulnerability. Infant and child mortality rates were staggering, often with 25 to 50% of children dying before reaching puberty. Causes were myriad: infectious diseases, accidents, predation, and periodic acute malnutrition. Life expectancy at birth was low, typically in the 20s or 30s, though those who survived to adulthood had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s or 60s. Death was often sudden and brutal, from an infected wound, a failed hunt, a poisonous bite, or childbirth. Food security was precarious, subject to the whims of climate, season, and prey migration. Periods of abundance were inevitably followed by periods of famine and severe nutritional stress, leaving skeletons with telltale signs of growth arrest and dietary deficiency. The constant background anxiety of scarcity and the visceral grief of frequent child loss were universal human experiences. The concept of primal egalitarianism also requires significant qualification. While rigid, hereditary class structures did not exist, this does not mean societies were without hierarchy or coercion. Status was fluid and constantly negotiated, often based on personal attributes like hunting prowess, shamanistic knowledge, or social influence. Egalitarianism was frequently maintained not through an innate distaste for dominance, but through what anthropologists call leveling mechanisms. These were cultural practices designed to curb the ambition of would-be alpha individuals through gossip, ridicule, disobedience, or even assassination. The threat of violence from the group kept individual ambition in check. This was a tense and precarious form of equality, born of mutual fear and enforced by social sanction, not a reflection of a fundamental human pacifism or innate commitment to equity. The implications of this more accurate historical picture are profound. It shatters the romantic myth of a lost golden age, revealing that the human psyche was not shaped in a Garden of Eden, but in a demanding and often terrifying world. Our capacity for xenophobia, our quickness to anger, our vigilance to social slights, our relentless drive for status and resources, these are not modern corruptions. They are the legacy of a deep evolutionary past where such traits were essential for survival. Paranoia about outsiders enhanced group security. Aggression helped acquire and defend resources. Status seeking ensured better access to food and mates. Anxiety was a vital early warning system. This recognition forces a more clear-eyed assessment of modernity. While contemporary life introduces new forms of stress, alienation, and existential anxiety, it has undeniably alleviated many of the ancient horrors that plagued our ancestors. Most humans today live with a dramatically reduced risk of violent death, starvation, and the loss of their children. This is not to dismiss the very real problems of the modern world, but to contextualize them against the backdrop of a far more physically brutal existence. Our evolved minds, calibrated for immediate threat and scarcity, now navigate a world of abstract pressures and abundance. The challenge is not to romanticize a brutal past, but to understand how the instincts it bred manifest in a world they were not designed for. Biases, Stone Age solutions. Modern discourse frequently laments human irrationality. Our tendencies toward prejudice, our vulnerability to misinformation, and our flawed decision-making are often cited as evidence of a fundamental cognitive deficit. This perspective, however, misunderstands the nature of the human mind. What we now classify as cognitive biases and irrational shortcuts were not evolutionary oversights. They were highly efficient and adaptive solutions to the specific problems of survival and reproduction faced by our ancestors in a vastly different world. These mental heuristics were not designed for truth-seeking or optimal statistical reasoning in a modern context, but for speed, energy conservation, and social cohesion in an environment of immediate physical peril and limited information. The bitter truth is that our reasoning is profoundly shaped by Stone Age solutions that are often spectacularly mismatched to the complexities of contemporary life. The utility of these shortcuts becomes clear when examined through the lens of ancestral priorities. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms pre-existing beliefs, is typically derided as a source of error. In a prehistoric context, however, it was a vital energy-saving and stability-preserving mechanism. Constantly questioning every core belief about which plants are poisonous, which animals are dangerous, or the wisdom of tribal elders would have been paralyzing and costly. Once a useful understanding of the world was established, e.g., a certain waterhole is frequented by predators, a bias toward confirming this belief ensured swift, decisive action and protected hard-won knowledge from being easily overturned by anomalous but potentially misleading evidence. It promoted cognitive consistency and reinforced the shared beliefs that bound the group together. Similarly, in group favoritism, the predisposition to prefer and trust members of one's group was a cornerstone of survival. In a world where the primary social units were small, kin-based bands competing for scarce resources, unconditional loyalty to the in-group was essential for cooperation in hunting, defense, and childcare. Distrusting or being overly critical of one's tribe would have weakened the coalition, making everyone more vulnerable. The heuristic to instinctively favor us over them was a brilliant social algorithm for maintaining the cohesion necessary for survival, even if it came at the expense of fairness toward outsiders. Other heuristics also serve critical functions. The fundamental attribution error, explaining others' behavior by their character, while explaining our own by our circumstances, facilitated rapid social assessment. When a member of a rival tribe acted aggressively, attributing it to their inherent maliciousness, they are violent people, was a fast, efficient, and often accurate judgment that justified caution or preemptive defense. Taking the time to consider the situational pressures on that individual, perhaps they were starving, would have been a dangerous luxury. The availability heuristic, where we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind, prioritizes recent and vivid information. Remembering the vivid details of a recent leopard attack and consequently overestimating the immediate danger was a far safer strategy than accurately calculating the long-term statistical risk, which might lead to fatal complacency. These were not flaws in logic, but features of a system optimized for good enough decisions that maximized survival chances in the near term. The profound implication for the modern world is that these once adaptive tools now routinely generate poor judgment, social conflict, and systemic error. The same confirmation bias that protected tribal knowledge now fuels political polarization and insulates believers in conspiracy theories from counter-evidence, as they curate information ecosystems that constantly reinforce their views. In-group favoritism, essential for band-level cohesion, now manifests as nationalism, racism, and partisan animosity on a global scale, hindering cooperation for complex, transnational challenges. The fundamental attribution error drives us to demonize political opponents or individuals from different social classes as morally bankrupt, rather than understanding the situational and structural factors that shape their behavior. The availability heuristic, hijacked by graphic news cycles and social media algorithms, causes us to overestimate rare but dramatic risks like terrorism or plane crashes while underestimating gradual, complex threats like climate change or dietary health. Recognizing that these tendencies are misfired adaptations rather than simple stupidity or moral failure is the crucial first step in mitigating their negative effects. It shifts the focus from blaming individuals for their irrationality to designing systems that anticipate these predictable cognitive failures. This can include structuring decision-making processes to require considering disconfirming evidence, creating diverse teams to counter in-group thinking, implementing blind evaluations to reduce bias, and educating the public on the nature of these heuristics to foster greater intellectual humility. Our Stone Age minds are a permanent inheritance, but through conscious effort and intelligent environmental design, we can compensate for their anachronistic impulses and better align our decisions with the demands of the modern world. This arduous process of self-correction is the price of wielding a powerful but outdated cognitive toolkit. Mismatch: Stone Age and the Digital Age. Humanity has engineered a world of unprecedented material comfort, safety, and convenience. Yet, this triumph over nature's immediate hardships has coincided with a paradoxical surge in psychological and physiological ailments, including anxiety disorders, depression, obesity, and profound loneliness. This contradiction stems from a fundamental and often overlooked truth. Our species is in exile in time. Our brains and bodies are essentially Pleistocene adaptations, meticulously honed for a world that vanished in the blink of an evolutionary eye. The architecture of our minds, our motivational systems, and our physiological responses are calibrated for challenges and rewards that bear little resemblance to the modern environment we have created. The resulting dissonance is not a sign of individual failure, but a predictable consequence of living with Stone Age machinery in a digital age world. The environment of evolutionary adaptedness was characterized by a specific set of conditions that shaped our fundamental needs and responses. Socially, we existed in small, tight-knit bands of roughly 50 to 150 individuals, where everyone knew each other intimately, interactions were face-to-face, and social standing was clear and constantly negotiated through direct feedback. Physically, life demanded constant, moderate activity for foraging, hunting, and migration. Threats were typically immediate and physical: a predator, a rival band, requiring a sharp, acute stress response that culminated in fight or flight, followed by resolution. Rewards were equally immediate: the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the sweetness of ripe fruit, a rare caloric windfall. Information was scarce and primarily relevant to immediate survival. Our neurological and hormonal systems are exquisitely tuned to this reality, seeking the high-calorie fats and sugars that were once rare, bonding through direct physical co-presence, and reacting to social threats with the intensity appropriate for a small, interdependent group where ostracism meant death. Modernity, however, presents a landscape that is almost perfectly designed to dysregulate these ancient systems. Socially, we are surrounded by thousands of strangers, leading to a state of crowded anonymity that our brains interpret as a perpetual state of potential social threat without the comforting bonds of a known tribe. Our professional lives are largely sedentary, a radical departure from the physical exertion that regulated our mood, metabolism, and energy systems. The threats we face are now chronic and abstract: financial instability, climate change, performance reviews, and social media criticism. These trigger the same primal stress response system: cortisol release, heightened alertness, but without the physical outlet or the clear resolution that allows the system to shut down, leading to a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. Our reward systems are bombarded with supernormal stimuli: hyperpalatable foods engineered to exploit our innate cravings for salt, fat, and sugar, and digital platforms that deliver intermittent social validation through likes and shares, creating addictive loops that our brains are powerless to resist. We suffer from information overload, a constant stream of global tragedies and trivialities that our threat detection apparatus is compelled to monitor but cannot act upon. This profound mismatch offers a powerful explanatory framework for many modern plagues. The epidemic of anxiety can be understood as a predator detection system stuck in a permanent, futile alarm state, triggered by emails, news alerts, and social comparisons instead of saber-toothed cats. Depression often arises from a deep sense of purposelessness or a perceived loss of status within an impossibly large and complex social hierarchy, coupled with a lack of the meaningful, tangible labor that provided immediate feedback and a sense of contribution in small-scale societies. Obesity is the inevitable outcome of a metabolism designed for calorie conservation and a brain wired to seek energy-dense foods, now placed in an environment of limitless abundance. Loneliness persists despite digital hyperconnectivity because virtual interactions lack the deep, subconscious exchange of pheromones, touch, and shared physical experience necessary to trigger the neurochemical responses that create a true sense of bonding and security. We are, in a very real sense, fish out of water, equipped with gills to extract oxygen from a sea we no longer inhabit. Recognizing this evolutionary mismatch is not a counsel of despair, but a critical act of self-diagnosis. It reframes personal struggle not as a character flaw, but as a predictable response to an environment for which we are poorly designed. This understanding shifts the focus from asking, "What is wrong with me?" to "What is wrong with my environment?" and "How can I reshape it to better suit my ancient nature?" The solution lies not in rejecting modernity, but in consciously designing our lives to reintroduce elements of our evolutionary past, prioritizing deep, small-scale community, incorporating regular physical movement, managing exposure to supernormal stimuli, and seeking purpose in tangible, localized action. The challenge of the 21st century is to bridge the gap between the world we built and the minds we inherited. Genes, the loaded dice. Of all the ideas that underpin modern sensibilities, few are as deeply cherished as the concept of the blank slate, the belief that we are born essentially equal and undetermined, our minds and destinies shaped solely by upbringing, culture, and experience. This vision of limitless potential is empowering, placing the responsibility for outcomes squarely on society and the environment. However, decades of rigorous scientific research in behavioral genetics present a profound and, to some, discomforting challenge to this worldview. The evidence suggests we do not arrive in this world as empty vessels, but as complex beings significantly pre-wired by our genetic inheritance. This is not an argument for determinism, but a recognition that the dice of our lives are loaded at conception, setting a powerful baseline that influences our entire life's trajectory. The empirical foundation for this conclusion comes primarily from studies of twins and adoptees, which are designed to disentangle the effects of genetics from those of shared environment. Identical twins, who share 100% of their genes, are consistently found to be far more similar to each other on a host of psychological traits than fraternal twins, who share only about 50% of their genes, even when raised in the same household. Perhaps more strikingly, identical twins raised apart in different families often demonstrate remarkable similarities in core aspects of their personality and intellect. Adoption studies further reinforce this, showing that adopted children's psychological traits correlate more strongly with those of their biological parents, whom they have never known, than with those of their adoptive parents who raised them. This body of research has revealed substantial heritability for a wide range of characteristics. General intelligence, or cognitive ability, shows one of the highest and most stable heritability estimates, with genetics accounting for a significant portion of the variation between individuals, a proportion that often increases into adulthood as people seek out environments that match their genetic predispositions. The major dimensions of personality, such as extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience, all demonstrate moderate to high heritability. Even more tellingly, the susceptibility to major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and clinical depression is heavily influenced by genetic factors. The reach of this genetic influence extends into seemingly cultural domains, with studies indicating that predispositions towards certain political attitudes, religiosity, and social values are also partly heritable. Genes do not code for a specific political party, but they may code for personality traits like openness or conscientiousness that make one more likely to gravitate towards certain ideologies. The critical nuance, often lost in popular interpretation, is that heritability does not mean genetic determinism. Genes are not a fixed blueprint that dictates an inevitable outcome. Instead, they establish a range of potential, a reaction norm, that interacts dynamically with the environment. A genetic predisposition for high cognitive potential will not manifest in an environment of severe deprivation. Similarly, a genetic vulnerability for depression may never be triggered in a consistently supportive and low-stress environment. However, Our genes also influence how we experience and shape our environments, a process known as gene-environment correlation. A child with a naturally cheerful and outgoing temperament, high extroversion, will elicit more positive social responses and seek out more social situations, thereby reinforcing their innate tendency. A child prone to anxiety, high neuroticism, might perceive neutral events as threatening, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of stress. Genes thus play an active role in steering us toward the very experiences that will, in turn, amplify our genetic tendencies. The implications of this genetic loading are far-reaching and often difficult to reconcile with deeply held notions of fairness and meritocracy. It directly challenges simplistic nurture-only explanations for human behavior, forcing a more nuanced interactionist model. This perspective can foster greater understanding and reduce stigma, particularly in areas like mental health, where conditions can be reframed not as personal failings or the sole result of a bad childhood, but as the manifestation of a biological vulnerability. It highlights the critical importance of goodness of fit, the idea that outcomes are optimized not by trying to force every individual into the same mold, but by matching environments and opportunities to innate predispositions. A genetically introverted child may thrive in a different educational setting than a highly extrovert one, even within the same family. Ultimately, this knowledge raises complex and uncomfortable questions about the very foundations of our social structures. If we do not all start from the same place, how do we define equality of opportunity? To what extent can we hold individuals responsible for behaviors and tendencies that have a strong biological component? The idea of the loaded dice does not negate the role of effort, culture, or social justice, but it does complicate it immensely. It suggests that the project of building a good society must account for the invisible hand of heredity, working not against nature, but with a clearer understanding of its constraints. This acceptance of our biological starting point is the necessary precursor to any meaningful discussion of the free will we may exercise within its bounds. Sexual conflict, the hidden tension. The struggles that manifest between men and women in romantic relationships, arguments over commitment, jealousy, intimacy, and responsibility, are often experienced as deeply personal failures or character flaws. This perspective, while emotionally compelling, overlooks a more fundamental and disquieting reality. Beneath the surface of individual disputes flows a powerful undercurrent of sexual conflict, a concept in evolutionary biology describing how the differing reproductive investments of males and females create inherently divergent and often opposing fitness interests. The tensions that feel uniquely personal are, in large part, the manifestation of an ancient and impersonal biological struggle, a legacy of strategies that were evolutionarily successful in a world long gone. The engine of this conflict is anisogamy, the difference in the size and cost of gametes. A man's minimal biological investment is the production of sperm, which is energetically cheap and abundant. This allows for a theoretically vast reproductive output, constrained primarily by access to fertile mates. A woman's investment, however, is immense. She produces a limited number of costly eggs, followed by the metabolic demands of pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, and the extended period of lactation and infant care. This asymmetry sets the stage for profoundly different optimal mating strategies. For men, natural selection favored traits that increased the number of sexual partners and ensured that any investment was directed toward genetically related offspring. This drives a greater inherent interest in short-term mating opportunities and a powerful concern with paternity certainty. For women, the high cost of reproduction makes partner quality, rather than quantity, the paramount concern. Her strategy is necessarily more selective, favoring males who can provide either direct resources and long-term investment to support her and her offspring, or high-quality genes that will enhance the offspring's fitness, or ideally both. This fundamental divergence in strategic interests is the root of countless relational dynamics. It fuels the well-documented gender jealousy gap, Men tend to exhibit greater distress in response to a partner's sexual infidelity, which threatens paternity certainty, while women experience greater distress in response to a partner's emotional infidelity, which threatens the diversion of commitment and resources. It drives mate-guarding behaviors, where individuals attempt to control their partner's interactions with potential rivals. It underlies deception about intentions, such as a man feigning long-term interest for short-term gain, or a woman downplaying involvement with other suitors to secure investment from a primary partner. Conflicts over the timing of sex and commitment are a direct expression of this strategic clash. From a classical evolutionary perspective, a man might benefit from accelerating sexual intimacy to secure mating opportunities without immediate cost, while a woman might benefit from delaying intimacy to assess a partner's willingness and ability to commit resources over the long term. After childbirth, a new phase of conflict can emerge over the allocation of parental investment. A man, whose potential reproductive opportunities remain high, may be motivated to seek additional mates, while a woman requires his continued investment to ensure the survival of their current offspring. These are not conscious, calculated strategies in the modern human, but the emotional and behavioral outputs of evolved psychological adaptations that were shaped by these recurring ancestral challenges. The implications of this inherent conflict are vast and account for some of the most painful aspects of human relationships. It is the deep, often unspoken, tension that underlies incidents of infidelity, obsessive possessiveness, and damaging communication breakdowns where partners feel their core needs are fundamentally misunderstood. It contributes to persistent domestic strife over division of labor, financial priorities, and social freedom. In its most extreme and tragic form, this evolutionary backdrop is a factor in intimate partner violence and sexual coercion, which can be viewed as maladaptive and criminal manifestations of mate guarding and sexual entitlement strategies. Recognizing this deep evolutionary root does not in any way excuse harmful or abusive behavior, which remains a moral and legal failing of the individual. Instead, it provides a depersonalized framework for understanding the origin of these powerful and destructive emotions. This evolutionary perspective offers a pathway toward more effective and compassionate solutions. By understanding that certain tensions are not necessarily a sign of a broken relationship or a deficient partner, but rather a predictable result of our evolved natures, couples can depersonalize the conflict. This allows them to address these issues as a shared problem to be managed cooperatively, rather than as a battle to be won. It encourages explicit communication about needs and fears that have deep biological resonance, such as the need for emotional security or the fear of being used. Acknowledging the underlying tensions allows for the conscious construction of relationships based on mutual agreement and trust, creating modern solutions, through explicit commitment, shared goals, and clear boundaries, to manage the ancient and often conflicting dictates of our evolved psychology. The battle of the sexes is not a myth, it is a biological reality. The opportunity for peace lies not in denying this reality, but in consciously choosing to transcend it. Reason's servant, the primacy of emotion. Humanity's self-conception is dominated by the image of Homo sapiens, the wise, rational being whose intellect elevates us above base instinct. This flattering portrait places conscious, logical thought at the helm of our behavior, directing our actions through dispassionate analysis. However, a convergence of evidence from neuroscience, psychology, and behavioral economics presents a far more humbling and unsettling reality. Our celebrated rationality is not the master but the servant, employed primarily to justify decisions and impulses that originate in the ancient, emotional cores of our brain. We are not primarily logical creatures who sometimes feel. We are emotional creatures who sometimes reason. This inversion of the traditional hierarchy is a bitter truth, as it challenges our sense of autonomy and reveals the disconcerting power of forces within us that we do not consciously control. The evolutionary rationale for this design is one of efficiency and survival. In the environments where our brains were shaped, swift action was often more valuable than deliberate analysis. The individual who paused to rationally calculate the statistical probability of a rustle in the grass being a predator was more likely to be eaten than the one who experienced a jolt of fear and immediately fled. Emotions like fear, desire, disgust, and anger are evolution's rapid response systems. They are complex physiological and psychological programs that instantly assess a situation and compel action. Approach, avoidance, repulsion, aggression, affiliation, long before the slower processes of the prefrontal cortex can formulate a verbal, logical argument. These effective responses are not random. They are learned and innate biases shaped by natural selection to solve recurrent adaptive problems. Disgust prevents us from consuming toxins. Anger motivates us to defend against cheaters. Desire drives us toward valuable resources and mates. The role of conscious reasoning in this process is largely post hoc. The neuroscientific work of researchers like Antonio Damasio has demonstrated that patients with damage to emotional brain centers become profoundly incapable of making decisions, even with intact logic centers, revealing that emotion is not an impediment to choice but its necessary foundation. Studies using brain imaging show that neural activity indicating a simple choice can be detected in emotional regions several seconds before the conscious mind is aware of having made a decision. The conscious self then engages in a process of confabulation, constructing a seemingly rational narrative to explain why that particular choice was made. We feel a distrust for someone, and then our reasoning mind scours for evidence to justify it. A slight hesitation in their voice, a past failure. We desire an object and then list its practical benefits. This is not to say that reason is powerless, but that its primary function is often that of a lawyer or a public relations agent, building a case for a verdict that has already been delivered by the emotional jury. The implications of this cognitive architecture are profound and often disheartening. It explains the persistent and frustrating human tendency toward motivated reasoning, where we effortlessly accept evidence that supports our pre-existing beliefs and the emotional commitments that underpin them, while employing rigorous skepticism to dismantle contradictory facts. It clarifies why political and ideological debates are so intractable. Arguments are not evaluated on pure logical merit, but on how they make us feel about our tribe, our status, and our identity. A fact that feels threatening to our worldview will be rejected, regardless of its veracity. This is why data and logic alone are so often ineffective at changing minds. The emotional substrate must be addressed first. The most compelling rhetoric is not that which provides the most accurate information, but that which most effectively aligns with and mobilizes the audience's latent fears, hopes, and desires. Recognizing the primacy of emotion does not mean surrendering to irrationality. On the contrary, it is the first and most crucial step toward genuine rationality. True rationality is not the default state of a perfectly logical mind. It is a hard-won skill, a disciplined practice of metacognition. It requires the constant and humbling interrogation of our intuitive impulses. It means asking, why do I believe this? Is it because the evidence is compelling, or because it feels right? What emotional payoff does this belief provide me? This form of self-awareness allows us to identify when our reasoning is being covertly directed by fear, envy, or tribalism. Our strength as a species lies not in the illusion of pure reason, but in our capacity to use our slow, conscious cognition to guide, temper, and occasionally veto the powerful passions that evolution has bequeathed us. It is the difficult art of making the servant a wise advisor to the king. And all these passions, conflicts, and drives ultimately serve a process that is utterly indifferent to the individual experiencing them, a truth that may be the most difficult to accept of all. Mortality, evolution's cold equation. The fear of death is a universal and defining human experience, a profound source of terror, grief, and existential anguish. The loss of a loved one feels like a catastrophic error, a theft of meaning and future. This personal, visceral perspective, however, stands in stark opposition to the vast, impersonal logic of natural selection. From an evolutionary standpoint, death is not a tragedy, but a fundamental prerequisite. It is the essential engine that drives the entire process of adaptation and complexity. Our deep emotional response to mortality is a biological imperative for survival, but it exists within a system that requires our ultimate disposal. This is perhaps the most difficult truth to reconcile. The very process that gave us life and consciousness is built upon the necessity of our annihilation. Evolution operates through a simple, three-part algorithm: variation, selection, and inheritance. Genetic variation arises through mutation and recombination, creating a diversity of individuals with different traits. Environmental pressures then act as a filter, selecting for those traits that best enhance survival and reproduction in a given context. Finally, these selected traits are inherited by the next generation. For this cycle to function, turnover is mandatory. Older generations must make way for new ones. If individuals were to achieve biological immortality, the process of evolution would grind to a halt. New, potentially superior genetic combinations would have no opportunity to replace older, less adapted ones. The environment changes, climates shift, new pathogens emerge, resources fluctuate, and a static population, no matter how well adapted to a previous era, would face eventual extinction. Death is the mechanism that allows a species to remain dynamic and responsive to an ever-changing world. This logic is reflected in the very design of our bodies, a phenomenon explained by the theory of antagonistic pleiotropy. Genes that confer a benefit early in life, promoting successful growth and reproduction, can be selected for even if they have harmful effects later in life, after the peak reproductive period. There is no selective pressure to build an organism that lasts indefinitely. The pressure is to build one that is robust enough to reach reproductive age, successfully mate, and in species with parental care, raise offspring to independence. Once this primary biological mandate is fulfilled, the force of selection weakens dramatically. The result is not a body designed for graceful aging, but one designed for a period of high function, followed by inevitable decline. Cellular repair mechanisms become less efficient, tissues accumulate damage, and immune systems wane, not because this is optimal for the individual, but because there was no evolutionary advantage in preventing it. We are not built to last, we are built to reproduce. The implications of this cold equation cast the human condition in a stark and challenging light. Our intense fear of death, our overwhelming grief, and our powerful drive for self-preservation are not flaws. They are exquisitely calibrated adaptations. An organism that did not fiercely resist death would not survive long enough to pass on its genes. The searing pain of losing a parent, a partner, or a child is the emotional signature of our deep investment in kin, whose survival represents the success of our genetic legacy. Our struggle with mortality is a biological imperative, a fight for the survival of the conscious self and those who carry our genes forward. Yet, this deeply personal anguish occurs within a system that is utterly indifferent to it. The evolutionary process has no goal, no consciousness, and no empathy. It does not care about our happiness, our suffering, or our search for meaning. It merely favors strategies that lead to successful replication. The necessity of death is a mere logistical requirement for this replication, a clearing of the stage for the next act. This creates a profound dissonance. We are beings who crave permanence, meaning, and connection, forged by a process that requires impermanence, has no inherent meaning, and operates through the disposable vessel of the individual. Our entire cultural, spiritual, and philosophical history can be interpreted as a monumental effort to reconcile this conflict, to find or impose meaning upon a biological reality that is fundamentally amoral and mechanistic. Our search for meaning, from religion to art to legacy building, is thus a confrontation with this impersonal machinery. The temporary vessel attempts to inscribe something permanent upon a process that demands its erasure. We seek to become more than the carriers of our genes. We strive to be authors of our narrative. But this narrative is always written against the backdrop of evolution's cold equation, which reminds us that our consciousness, for all its brilliance, is a fleeting byproduct of a strategy for replication. Which brings us, finally, to the most profound implication of all, the one that underlies this entire existential struggle, the silent void at the heart of the process that created us. The universe's silent answer. We gaze at the stars, construct elaborate philosophies, and devote our lives to the pursuit of purpose, perpetually asking the most human of questions. What is the meaning of life? We seek an answer etched in the fabric of the cosmos, a divine plan, or a fundamental law of nature that confers significance upon our existence. The very scientific framework that provides the most powerful explanation for our being, the process of evolution by natural selection, responds to this profound inquiry with a deafening and unsettling silence. It reveals a universe that is not merely indifferent to our quest, but structurally incapable of answering it. The brutal truth is that the meaning we desperately seek is not a hidden secret to be discovered, but a burden and a responsibility that falls solely upon us. The mechanism of evolution is, at its core, an unguided and amoral algorithm. It operates through a simple, recursive cycle. Genetic variation arises through random mutation and recombination. Environmental pressures, predation, climate, disease, competition act as a filter, selecting which variations confer a survival and reproductive advantage. These selected traits are then inherited by subsequent generations. There is no teleology in this process, no endpoint, no intended direction. It does not strive toward complexity, consciousness, or anything else. The appearance of a grand progression from simple to complex is a retrospective illusion, a contingent outcome of incremental steps, each only slightly more advantageous than the last in a specific context. The process is devoid of any concern for suffering, joy, justice, or beauty. A gene that causes immense suffering but enhances reproductive success will be selected for. A trait that promotes cooperation and reduces pain but lowers fitness will be selected against. The system is not cruel. It is merely mathematical, a cold calculus of replication rates playing out across deep time. This scientific understanding carries a profound and difficult implication. The meaning we crave is not an external feature of the universe, waiting to be revealed by a telescope or a microscope. It is an internal projection, a construct generated by our extraordinary brains. We are the product of that blind evolutionary process, and our minds were shaped for specific tasks: navigating social hierarchies, securing resources, avoiding predators, and raising offspring. Our intelligence, our hypersociality, and our powerful drive to detect patterns are adaptations that serve these ends. Our capacity for awe, love, art, and profound abstract thought is likely byproducts, spandrels, of this cognitive machinery. The question why itself is a testament to a brain that evolved to model the world, predict outcomes, and infer agency and intention in others. It is a tool for survival that we now turn upon the cosmos itself, and we are met with silence. This realization is not a descent into nihilism, but a clarion call to a more mature and authentic form of meaning. If there is no script, no predetermined purpose handed down from nature or the universe, then we are presented with radical freedom. The answer to the question of meaning does not lie in our origins, but in our actions. It lies in what we choose to create, value, and protect here and now. The love we feel for our partners and children, the beauty we find in art and nature, the justice we strive to build in our societies, the knowledge we seek. These are not illusions. They are real experiences, real connections, and real values generated by conscious beings. They are meaningful to us. They are the significance that we, as a community of sentient creatures, bring into existence through our choices and our relationships. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself, and in that consciousness, we can assign value, to curate wonder, and to weave narratives of purpose. So we find ourselves in a sobering yet ultimately liberating position, conscious stardust adrift in a vast, indifferent cosmos. There is no script, no grand design, only the universe unfolding according to its physical laws. And we evolve to wonder, to feel, to connect, to create meaning where none inherently exists. Perhaps that is our most profound adaptation, not our intelligence alone, but our collective ability to look into the void and build significance, together, moment by fleeting moment. We are the authors, not the readers, of the story. Let that thought settle, not as a weight of despair, but as the foundation of our true agency. The silence of the universe is not an emptiness to be feared, but a canvas upon which we are free to paint.